Newsroom, and joining me here in the studio in Parliament House is Liberal Senator James Paterson. The Senate's sitting, there are divisions going on, so we might lose you to those in a moment, Senator, but thanks for joining us in the meantime. I mentioned before we dipped in for a little while to Tony Abbott speaking on China at the moment at the Lowy Institute. Now we've had Paul Keating, Kevin Rudd, Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott, and you mentioned to me, I think Julie Bishop, the former Foreign Minister, is speaking on China today as well. Is this helpful for a government that's trying to manage a difficult relationship to have so many former players giving public advice?
Well, Chris, democracy can be messy at times and free speech can be messy at times, but I wouldn't trade it for any other system. I think it's a healthy thing that our leaders and former leaders are grappling, including grappling publicly, with these big questions in Australia's relationship with China, because it is the question of our age. It is the issue that will define the next few decades, how we relate to China. So I think it's a healthy thing that we're contributing to that debate and informing the public in the process.
The person we probably hear least from on this issue is the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne.
I don't think that's fair. She gave a great speech a couple of weeks ago on Australia's engagement with China, where she really set out very clearly on a principled basis how we'll engage with China, and particularly on those tricky issues like human rights. She spoke very clearly about Hong Kong, about the Uyghur people, and about Dr Yang, the Australian citizen who's detained there right now.
What's her advice to you and Andrew Hastie, whether or not you should continue to pursue opportunities to go to China for a study tour, whether you should be seeking any explanations or building relations with the Chinese embassy here? What's the advice to you on to follow up after you were denied that visa to China?
I'll be a little bit restrained, Chris, in what I share publicly about the private conversations I have with colleagues, Foreign Minister and others included. But generally speaking, most of my colleagues in government thought it was a good thing that Andrew and I were interested in going to China, thought that we would benefit from that experience and learn from it, and they all thought that it was very disappointing that we weren't denied that opportunity. I don't think any invitations will be forthcoming for Andrew or I in the short term. We're certainly not holding our breaths.
Should we be reaching out now? Should Australia be inviting senior Chinese officials here?
I'm sure those kind of conversations are happening all the time at the diplomatic level, and I think engagement with China, despite the events of recent weeks, is still a very important and worthwhile thing to do.
Now, what's your sense of the public debate here? There have been warnings from Kevin Rudd, even from Scott Morrison going back during the Gladys Liu affair, making sure that there's no rise of xenophobia, no anti-Chinese sentiment in a racist way, I suppose. Pauline Hanson the other day on this show said she was worried China wanted to send a lot of people here. Most people have just scoffed at that. My sense is that there's been no hint of racism in this, that the country is just dealing with this maturely. It's about our relationship with a communist government.
I think our leaders are right to be wary about us potentially going down that path, because it would certainly be a very bad thing. I particularly don't want the 1.2 million Australians who have Chinese ethnicity to feel that they are any less Australian than any other Australian, that they're any less welcome, or that there is any question marks over their loyalty or their commitment to this country, because in my experience there are no issues there at all. I have no concerns. Having said that, we shouldn't also allow that to restrain our public debate about our relationship, particularly with the Chinese Communist Party. We just have to draw a really bright line distinction between the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand and the Chinese people on the other, because they are separate things.
Although we know that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to infiltrate Australian institutions via some Australian Chinese citizens.
That's right, Chris. There's enormous pressure on the Chinese diaspora around the world, but particularly in countries like Australia, from the Chinese Communist Party. We know that one of the chief objectives of the United Front Work Department, which is the overseas propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party, is to corral and pressure the Chinese diaspora into supporting their political objectives. And I know a lot of Chinese Australians do feel pressured by that.
Do you ever chat to Gladys Liu about these issues?
Yeah, I do. I chat to Gladys about it all the time, because obviously she's a colleague with Chinese heritage herself, but she's
alive to these risks?
I think she is, and she represents an electorate with a very significant Chinese community that has very diverse opinions within it. There are people in Chisholm who come from Hong Kong, who've come from Taiwan, who've come from Malaysia, who've come from mainland China, and depending on why they came and when they came, they might have very different views about the government in China.
Does she think that she was perhaps naive in the past and that she's a bit more realistic about these issues now? I'm asking you because She doesn't give too many interviews these days.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not Gladys's spokesman. I can't speak on her behalf, but I think she's acknowledged that she should have been more careful in her associations with some community groups before being elected to Parliament, and she's being much more stringent about that now. And I think that's a wise thing. That's a sensible thing.
Now, you like to keep an eye on the ABC, as I do. These new guidelines, editorial guidelines, are out from them today. Of course, they want to guard against hate speech. Who wouldn't? But one of the ways they say to do this is that we should be careful about using terms like us and our values. Don't use them in a way that should exclude anyone else. Are they being apologetic here about a nation that should have unifying values?
I think Australian values are universal. I think they apply to all of us and are shared by all of us regardless of our heritage, regardless of our skin colour, regardless of our religious faith, where we've come from, how long we've been here, how long our families have been here. And I think actually it's important for our national institutions, particularly our taxpayer-funded ones, to uphold and promote those unifying Australian values, not in a partisan political way, but those things that we do share as Australians. Absolutely, we should be proud of that and we should promote it.
Yeah, so is the ABC being... well, actually, it's more than silly guidelines. Is this symptomatic of the ABC being on retreating as the national broadcaster, retreating from perhaps one of its most important duties, and that is to share national values?
I think what the ABC does well at times is promote Australian stories to Australian audiences, and that does have an important unifying role to play in promoting our Australian culture. But at other times, and particularly when it becomes more political, they're very bad at doing that, and they become very caught up in modern fad trends like identity politics, which is incredibly divisive and dangerous, and it doesn't help.
Fascinating, though, that through its own Australia Talks survey, which is essentially a way of surveying Australia ABC audiences, even through that sample, the majority of people, the overwhelming majority of Australians, think political correctness has gone too far.
I thought that was so telling, Chris, because you're right, it is only a sample of effectively the ABC audience. It's not the broader Australian population, and that subset is not necessarily reflective of the broader population. But even ABC viewers themselves have a sense that political correctness has gone too far and that our public debate has been stifled as a result. And I think that's a real insight into where actually the very good common sense of most Australians is.
Now, has Angus Taylor knocked the government off the rails in the last week?
Well, it's certainly been a distraction, but only because the Labor Party is obsessing over this and has decided to call quorums and divisions and cause chaos in the House of Representatives this week. It's not deterring the government's focus from our priorities.
But Angus Taylor could fix it just by demonstrating to everybody, somehow explaining how these numbers were so wrong.
Well, I don't know, Chris. I don't know if that's true or not. I think he's provided the explanation he can to the Parliament. He's been supported by the Prime Minister in doing so, and he's a very valued colleague and a very effective minister.
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chris.